Okay, everybody, welcome back. This is the second lecture in our first week. We're looking at prehistoric media and the power and the impact that has, the lessons that we can learn from it. In the last lecture, we looked at how humanity's first communication occurred in these caves, and how those cave paintings created signs and symbols that allow us to understand how meaning is shaped, how meaning is carried, community has developed, and how even spirituality in life is represented. Today, or right now, I want to kind of zoom out from that picture a little bit, and instead of looking at a single artifact like cave paintings, I'm going to ask a bigger question, and that is, how do we study the history of communication itself? So think of this as kind of like building a toolkit that we're going to put tools in all semester. And so we need ways of thinking about communication history, or frameworks that could help us not just memorize inventions and people who invented them, the dates, because that's kind of boring, but maybe think more about what those inventions mean to us and how can we use those lessons in the ways that we use technology right now. Okay, so because communication history is not a timeline of different gadgets, it kind of is, but not really. It's a story of how media systems, writing, printing, broadcast, electricity, digital networks, reshaped culture, politics, and even the way that humans see themselves. Okay? All right. Big idea number one for this lecture is that communication is more than just transmission. For a very long time, communication scholars, you may have learned about this in 101, I probably taught it in 101, talked about the transmission model of information. So one person says something to another person and the message goes over, and then the other person sends the message back. That's the sender-receiver model, sometimes called the Wilbur-Schramm model, but it's a basic model. You've got the sender, the message, and the receiver. It's simple, neat, and easy to diagram, and easy for beginners to understand. But it's also really misleading, because communication isn't about moving information. It's about creating meaning within a social context. And if we go back to semiotics, you remember semiotics is the study of signs and symbols with the signified and the signifier. That idea of semiotics helps us understand this here too. So semiotics says that meaning isn't just inside the message, like a letter inside an envelope. It's produced through the interactions of signs within a culture. So example of this is the flag. Think about the American flag, for example. There's fabric, and the colors are the signifier. The idea of nationhood, unity, sacrifice is the signified. You could also, people who wave the flag tend to be patriotic. And in last 5 years, maybe more, people who wave the flag tend to be more Republican than people who don't. What I'm trying to say is that these meanings are shift culturally with different cultural events, different politics, things like that. So you've got the signifier being the colors of the flag and the fabric of the flag, and the signified is what it actually really means. And so what I'm trying to say is that meaning isn't automatic. There's not a dictionary that says this equals this. It's something completely different. Someone from outside U.S. culture might not feel anything when they see the flag, or they might have a different meaning for the flag, because all meaning is historical, it's learned, and it's often contested. But what that means is that there's often meaning is debated and socially constructed, and it changes all the time. And in class, maybe we'll give some examples, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. Okay? So when we study communication history, we're asking, how did the signs come to mean what they mean, and how do technologies give new power to some meanings and diminish other meanings? Okay, so an example of this is the old classic example of Socrates in writing. Plato tells us that Socrates did not like writing. And you may be asking yourself, why? Well, because he thought writing would destroy memory, and it actually does. He thought that people would stop exercising their minds and rely on external marks, writing, to fill in things for their brain. Now just think about that. Let's just stop and think about that for a second. If Socrates was so wound up about writing and how silly that looks like, let's take AI for example, and how people are saying that's going to replace humanity. But it's the same argument that Socrates has. And we've endured, we've gone forward, we've found ways of making meaning happen, and the world hasn't come crashing down. Okay. Now going back to Socrates, what's fascinating about Socrates is that writing just wasn't a tool. It was a threat to how humans thought. And that's exactly, like I said, how communication, or studying the history of communications, can help us understand the way that a medium reorganizes human consciousness. Okay. So was Socrates right about this? Well, he was partly right, partly wrong. Most of us couldn't memorize an entire epic poem today. They could way back then because they had to rely on their brains. But he was partly wrong too. Writing allowed cultures to preserve knowledge, make laws, and expand their traditions across generations and across national boundaries. Okay, so this shows us from the very beginning, communication technologies were never neutral. They always had trade-offs. Okay, so that's big idea number one. Big idea number two is that different approaches to communication history allow us to look at communication history in kind of different, in different paths, right? So communication history just isn't one thing. Depending on how we look at it, it could be multiple different things, right? So let me just give you some examples of this. The first way of looking at communication history is through a deterministic or technologically deterministic lens, okay? And this is the idea that inventions drive history. For example, the printing press caused the Reformation. There's some truth here. Without print, Martin Luther's 95 Thesis, the one he nailed up on the door of the church, right, could not have spread across Europe. Print multiplied his ideas in ways oral speech never could. But on the other hand, this perspective is a little bit simplistic. People still had to decide to read, to learn to read, to believe, and to act on Martin Luther's ideas. The Reformation wasn't just caused by ink and a piece of paper by themselves. Okay? It was caused by a complex interaction between technology, social needs, and cultural values. Super important. Okay. The second lane or lens we can look at is the cultural and social approaches to technology. Okay. The cultural and social approaches to technology emphasizes context over technology, but still technology is a part of it. For example, the telegraph just didn't speed up communication. It changed how people thought about time. Before the telegraph, time, if you want to say time, was local. Noon was noon wherever you were. And when the sun was highest in the sky, that's when noon was. For you, your town, and your community. After the telegraph, the railroads and stock markets needed some way to standardize times and time zones. And so all of a sudden, New York time mattered in Chicago. That's a cultural shift caused by a communication medium. Make sense? Okay. The third lens that we'll look at is called mediacology, and I may have mentioned it a little bit in class last time. This is where thinkers like Harold Innis, Marshall McLuhan, Lewis Mumford, Neil Postman, Elizabeth Eisenstein, all of those crazy people, that's where they come in. So Harold Innis talked about the bias of communication. He said that, like I mentioned before, that some media are time binding. They last for centuries, like stone carvings or manuscript, gold plates. Others are space binding. They travel fast, but they don't last long, like newspapers or radio. And so a society's balance between these two shapes its institution. Are we time bound or are we space bound? Okay. We'll talk about time and space a little bit in class. I'll try to get a learning activity there as well. Okay. Marshall McLuhan, his famous line is, "The medium is the message." He meant that the form that a medium takes matters more than the content. Television changes us not because of what's on TV, but because of what the medium of television encourages: visual, fast, emotional ways of knowing. Postman added that technologies create whole worldviews. Television, he argued, made us expect everything, even politics and religion, to be entertaining. So we need to be entertained now. Together, these thinkers remind us that communication history is ecological. Each new medium doesn't just add a tool, it changes the entire environment. Okay, here's another example, and it's the printing press. Okay, and let's apply all those three lenses to the printing press. So from a technological determinist view, the printing press caused modern democracy. From a cultural view, printing press took hold in Europe because there was already demand for Bibles, legal documents, and vernacular literature. From an ecological view, printing reshaped consciousness. It trained people to think linearly, to follow arguments step by step, and to imagine themselves as individuals with private access to texts. So all three are partly true. Communication history is powerful when we put all three of those lenses together to create an entire view of a technology. Okay, big idea number 3. And this is communication as power. Another crucial insight that I want to talk about here is that communication is almost always about power. Who owns the medium? Who controls the access? Whose voices get amplified? Whose voices get silenced? Okay, so think about the telegraph. It just didn't transmit dashes and I said that wrong. It didn't just transmit dots and dashes. It gave stockbrokers power to trade faster, generals the power to command armies from afar, and journalists the power to create national sense of breaking news. The same is true today. Whoever owns the servers, the platforms, the algorithms, those are the people and institutions that shape our symbolic environment. Okay, another historical case studies. In the 1930s and 40s, governments realized the persuasive power of radio. So Hitler used radio to spread propaganda across Europe. Franklin D. Roosevelt used radio for his fireside chats to build trust with Americans during the Great Depression. It's the same medium, radio, but different uses. That's why communication history always asks who benefits from this technology and what's at stake. An example from right now, if we fast forward to today, algorithms just don't deliver content. They have built-in biases. The printing press privileged illiterate elites. Radio privileged those who could afford airtime. Today, algorithms privilege whatever maximizes engagement, often outrage, spectacle, sensationalism. So studying history shows us these systems aren't neutral. They're cultural, they're political, and environments that shape what we feel. Environments shape what feels real to us. So, conclusion. Just to summarize, there's some bullet points here for you. Communication history is not just about inventions, it's about meaning. We can study it through different lenses: technological, cultural, and ecological. Media always reshape how people think, organize, and exercise power. And by studying the past, we gain tools for interpreting our present. So if our first lecture showed that prehistoric signs allowed humans to leave meaning behind, as in leftover meaning on the walls of caves, the permanent medium. This lecture shows us that how to study the bigger story of communication across history. It's the story of how we made meaning and how meaning in turn made us. All right, so that's the end of the lecture. I want you to go to Learning Suite and do the knowledge check, and then we'll see you in class, next class meeting. Thanks.